Welcome everyone to Challenge and Opportunities in Climate Finance amid turmoil in global energy markets, an event organized by the Washington Florida Society and Lewis Alumni Chapter of Washington, D.C., for which I serve as a chapter leader. Thanks to our audience for coming in person and ENI, our host, at their Washington, D.C. office. The seminar will be in Italian. Just kidding. We will kick off the event with a tour de table for our panelists, followed by question kickstart by the European Policy Organization, a student association at the MacArthur School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. A reception will follow, please stay with us, and the event will be recorded. So let me give you a couple of words of the impressive and long-standing professional career of our panelists. First, Sonia Gibbs, Managing Director, Head of Sustainable Finance, Institute of International Finance. Sonia has spent more than 20 years in banking, financial markets. She's a regular speaker at the industry conferences and has been frequent commentator for financial television and radio in her strategist roles.
And I'm still only 28.
We have Fabio Natalucci, Deputy Director, Monetary and Capital Market Department at the International Monetary Fund. Fabio oversees Global Financial Stability Report that gives the IMF assessment on global financial stability risk. Fabio is a Lewis alumnus. Marco Margheri, our host. Marco is the head of US Relations at ENI. Marco is also chair for Italy of the World Energy Council and sits on the board of the Atlantic Council. Thank you for being with us. So now I would say the first question to our speaker, Sonia. How important is climate finance work at the IIF, and how has this line of work evolved in recent years?
Well, thank you so much, Julian, and thanks to, sorry. I have to use the microphone. Grip it like this and hold it close to the mic. Hey, I've got it. First task accomplished. Get the microphone right. Thank you, Juliana, and thanks to ALL and DNI for this. It's a really very timely event, as is clear from the size of this audience. It's quite remarkable, especially on such a beautiful afternoon. If you had asked me this question 10 years ago, my answer would have been something like, climate finance is not even on the radar screen, not as such, right? But if you fast forward to today, and you've got so much more interest, it's a different world with policymakers, regulators, our clients in the financial sector, civil society, everyone is relying on and pushing the financial sector to drive transition. So it's a different world. It's very high on the radar screen now. And so for us at the Institute of International Finance, the IIF, we're a global association of cross sectors of financial firms, climate finance and transition planning are absolutely central. So there are three big challenges for us here. First of all, the financial sector cannot do it alone. I believe, Fabio, you've written about this in various GFSRs, that it has to be kind of a whole economy approach to transition. It's not just the financial sector, important though we are. So achieving net zero transition is going to require transformation of the entire global economy, all of our manufacturing processes, transportation, infrastructure, agriculture, energy sources. These are all, as you know, heavily carbon reliant at present. So when I say whole economy policies, we're talking about things like climate, carbon pricing, as the IMF has long recommended, sector-specific pathways for transition, right? If our clients aren't on a pathway to transition, nor can we be in the financial sector. Managed phase-out of high-emitting assets, getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies. These are not easy to achieve politically because different countries and different regions have different priorities in these matters. So getting it right globally is very difficult. So that's challenge number one. Challenge number two, I just sum it up as who's in charge? So many players, regulators, policymakers, the United Nations, civil society, NGOs, a lot of actors setting rules and guidelines, or trying to, in areas like disclosure, climate risk management, transition planning. So global financial firms that operate across borders just cannot function well with multiple and sometimes conflicting rule books We need international alignment, and we need it very badly. And that brings me to the third big challenge, which is on a more practical level, right? To have effective risk management and disclosure in the climate, and even beyond that in the natural capital space, you need data, right? Data gaps are still enormous. They're improving. Technology is helping. You have things like satellite technology and AI that are helping understand and measure climate impact. But the data gaps are still a real barrier to things like disclosure and risk management. And similarly, we don't have international agreement on things like metrics for climate and transition risk. And that's a very new and rapidly evolving field. Everybody thinks they have the best way to do it. I went to a whole seminar on transition value at risk, which, quite kind of overwhelmed me. It's like, I'm not even sure I understand what that means. And similarly, the lack of a common taxonomy and product definitions and labels, all of that is both a barrier to market growth and a risk of greenwashing. Or, the new term this year, transition washing, even better. So at the IIF, one big focus for us is climate-related risk and the capital framework. Right? For our banking members in particular, we engage with the Basel Committee, the Financial Stability Board, and other standard setters to clarify that just how important it is that there be global alignment here, and that the capital framework be risk-based and not be used to sort of penalize brown assets or incentivize green assets. And there are a lot of reasons why we think this, but two big ones are the risk of unintended consequences, that you shut off transition finance, and in particular finance to emerging markets, all of which have very carbon intensive business models or economic models. And then I would just take just a minute to define what we mean by transition finance, because it's one of the questions that we get most often, right? So this is not just financing solar and wind and all the green new technologies. That's an important part of it. So you've got, one is financing climate solutions. That's clearly transition finance. Another is financing firms that are already on a 1.5 degrees pathway, that are already pretty green, right? That's another kind of classic green finance. But a third category, and maybe the biggest one of all, is financing firms that are in the process of aligning to a 1.5 degrees pathway. And that is the core of transition finance, and that's what we need to make sure can happen. You don't want a regulatory framework that shuts off transition finance in that way. The fourth category is financing managed phase out. So what do we do about this? We gather our member perspectives, we build consensus, we respond to consultations, we do what associations do, but we also do a lot of research and collaboration. We work with the G20, with the G7, central banks. We're going to work with the NGFS on a blended finance handbook. So our main goal is public-private sector dialogue and collaboration. We want to enable that because it's the only way. This is a common problem, a mutual responsibility, and the only way we're going to solve it is to work together. So lots of room for public finance to take more risk and create the kind of environment that we need to unlock the climate finance so necessary.
Thank you so much. And now, speaking about international institutions, how does climate fit the mandate of the IMF, and what is the role of IMF in financing, fostering climate finance?
So I would say that climate has entered the IMF strongly over the last few years, right? So I can think about in terms of what the work done at the fund, how climate enters that equation along 3 dimensions. I think one is the impact on the outlook, right? So it's clearly affecting what the global outlook looks like, maybe not necessarily the baseline, but certainly around the risk, right? Whether these are climate events that hit some countries hard, or even just think in terms of the baseline, right? In terms of investment into renewables, brown versus green assets, so clearly affect the economic outlook, and now we think about this. The second aspect, I think, has to do with the fiscal aspect, right? So there's a fiscal cost, whether this is through insurance, for example, when there are climate-related events, or whether it has to do with what, from a fiscal standpoint, it means for governments to invest in adaptation mitigation. So it's clearly an aspect that has to do with the finance side. And then there's the financial market part. And maybe this is where I work on several topics with Sonia. And if I think about how it's affecting the department, I work in the monetary and capital markets department, and so thinking like the line of work that climate is entering now, there's a group of people thinking in terms of financial regulation, for example. That's close to what Sonia was mentioning. Think about how this is impact the financial institution in terms of risk management, in terms of stress testing, in some jurisdiction thinking about capital, for example, or requirement. So that's the regulatory aspect. There is the stress testing aspect. Stress testing, for example, the fund does what we call FSAP, or Financial Sector Assessment Programs for systemically important jurisdiction. And we have started to do stress testing, climate stress testing. So initially with more related to physical risk. So when a country gets hit by an extreme climate event, what would mean for, say, I don't know, an island in the Caribbean, for example. And we're starting to do also transition climate stress testing. So thinking about running from scenario in terms of transition and what does it mean for the financial sector of that jurisdiction. We have taken a different approach on this in terms of what the NGFS scenario. So the NGFS is Network for Greening the Financial System. It's a group of a coalition of the willings that was started in Europe by a few central banks and regulators. Now has grown into a lot of countries.
It's 120, right?
It's very large
phenomenal.
entity.
Yeah.
And it's different. It's not a standard setting body. It's not a regulator. So it allows the NGFS, I think, to go one step further with in terms of what they think and what can be done. Right? You are not really setting standards. So, but their scenario, what has been published so far, is always like long term. Right? This is like how we get to the Paris alignment objective. The way the fund does it, we're doing stress testing climate for transition on a short path. So over the next 1 to 3 years. I think the reason it's done this way because it has immediately policy implication, right? If I give a 20-year path, there's so many variables that can change technology, the macro. If I do over 1 to 3 years, that you need really to think about what the implication in terms of policies are. So there is that part. And then there is another one is the monetary policy. Some central banks have started to include climate into their, both the stress testing for banks, for example. Also thinking about what does it mean climate for example, the monetary policy framework. What does it mean for asset purchases, for example, in Europe? There's a discussion going there, the collateral policies. So that's the monetary policy piece. And then there's the part I work on, which is mostly on financing, the private finance. So how to scale up private finance so that we can actually finance the transition toward in alignment with the Paris objective. And that's where I think I interacted mostly with Sony on the private finance side. There the fund operates in different dimensions. I think one angle that we take is what we call the climate information architecture. So think about 3 legs of this. We need better data. So on the data side, the climate data, availability of data, reliability of data, and comparability of data. And I co-chair one NGFS workstream exactly on bridging the climate data gap. The second piece is harmonization of taxonomy/classifications. There's like more than 200 classification or taxonomies in the world between public and private, so clearly we need to converge at some point. For emerging markets in particular, the focus is on transition taxonomy, right? The system in these countries, they are in a different stage of development. It's not simply green or non-green, there's a lot of shades in the middle, so how to incentivize the transition toward green. That's typically an emerging market issue. And then there is the disclosure, the global disclosure. That's where we interact with the IFRS and the new established ISSB, the Board for Sustainability. So we engage effectively with a lot of outside partners at the international level, the FSB, in Europe. And then the last part we do, the fund, and maybe I'll come back to this later, but in the summer of last year, the IMF board approved a new lending facility called RST, Resilient Sustainability Trust, that is essentially, the objective is to lend on long term, so 20 years, below market rates to low-income countries, and create essentially fiscal space. So it comes with conditionality. There will be some conditions attached in terms of climate resilience, for example. But then that money creates fiscal space in the country government balance sheet that can be used essentially to lever up private finance, so to attract private finance. That's where I think, that's where we are now, and that's the most challenging part of what I think we're trying to do. And my job is to attract private capital, if you want, into these countries. So that's the most, I think, fascinating part of the work of the job now.
Thank you, Fabio. And now then the private capital, what does...
I was kind of scared when he said attract private capital.
That's how we
Yes,
separate
where's your
the... So what does decarbonization mean for a company like ENI, and how do private sector actors balance sustainability, energy security, and access to energy?
Well, thank you, and thank you for bearing with me till tomorrow morning. I will just say, as a little addition to your very kind presentation, that I'll have my Lewis course in 2 weeks, and I'm excited to run exactly this question to my students at the School of Government. It's a moment in the year I cherish. So. Now, let me start with a strange sentence by an author. Some of you may have seen Johnny Mnemonic. The author of Johnny Mnemonic is William Gibson, a futurologist, whatever this means, and a punk futurologist. And he used to say, in technology, future is already here, it's only unevenly distributed. And energy is nothing else today than distributing technology. We have some of the technologies we need, but those technologies are only invested upon in OECD world. We lack technologies that have to deliver, according to the International Energy Agency, 50% of the emissions reductions that we need till 2050. I don't know how much you're familiar with the climate framework, but the climate framework is all about achieving net zero in 2050. It's all about staying below a certain threshold in key areas of the world. And 50% of that effort has to rely on technologies that, says the International Energy Agency, are presently not on the market. If you consider that we sit today in 2023, when we speak 2050, in a sector that has evolved over a century, changing 50% of the carbon content that we emit in 25 years, that is a challenge. Can that challenge be pursued with companies out of the room? The answer is no. It's clearly no. Companies need to be around the table. But they need to be around the table bringing together the triangle of how they operate, i.e. business models and human capital, technology, and the regulatory framework, in a consistent and transparent manner. And Sonia and Fabio mentioned a key aspect here. Let me start from the regulatory framework. The emergence of non-state diplomacy, the relevance of private sector and technology engagement, the multi-layering of this conversation has made the regulatory framework around climate policy practically inoperable. I will only give you an example. In this country, I arrived in 2020. Late 2020, the United States of America started discussing climate disclosures. In Europe, in my previous life, I was responsible for implementing the climate disclosures package of a significant energy company. $500,000 worth of consulting exercise. So, a big piece, but honestly, nobody goes off market when they're listed on a significant stock exchange because of 500 pounds. In this country, the conversation on climate disclosures is still at the Stock Exchange Commission. And the likely outcome that we are hearing upon is that in Europe, we have a full book of climate disclosures that rely on the emissions trading scheme, whereby we are obliged to have a full set of monitoring, reporting, and verification mechanisms on a number of pollutants, but CO2 in the first place. And CO2 is famously traded and arrived yesterday beyond the $100 threshold per ton. How can you imagine climate policy when two big emitting regions do not even agree on how a company has to publish their CO2 emissions, hence taking commitments on CO2 emissions? Number one. Number two, business models and human capital. Clearly, and this is the only amendment that I will propose to Sonia, and we'll see through the discussion if we achieve an agreement on that. Companies sell stuff. So companies bring in demand. The entire climate change conversation has been on supply, has been on a taxonomy aspect that picks winners. This technology is good, that technology is bad. I come from Europe, and taxonomy in Brussels has become a religion. Is nuclear good or bad? Frankly speaking, for CO2 purposes, there is no doubt. But is nuclear good or bad is a conversation that has taken the whole of Brussels for 5 years. Is gas good or bad? Is a conversation that has blended a conversation on Greece, where gas has to replace lignite that pollutes 4 times as much, with France, where gas would displace nuclear, hence adding emissions. So the taxonomic approach has completely discarded bringing demand into the picture and has made the life of companies more difficult. Third and last, technology. How can you imagine to invest as much as we need in disruptive technologies if you have a top-down regulatory approach that picks winners? You have to pick emission reduction contributions as the key aspect. Now, what is E&I doing? And I'll stop here. Well, first, today we published it was our Capital Markets Day. And I invite you to read the backup slides rather than the slides on financial results. There is this slide on the ESG rankings of our peer group. We are first of our peer group in all ESG rankings. Why is it so? Second slide, still in the backup, but again, because we publish something that others do not publish. We have a capital allocation roadmap to switch from legacy energies into new energies, into clean technology, but we need to do that, and I'll come to this last point, across the board. We cannot imagine to shut down what we have presently in legacy energies that is serving demand that would otherwise be left unserved and take and rally the streets. Has it happened in seven unrests across the world were triggered by energy-related grievances in the last 3 years. So we cannot imagine to simply shut down supply. We need to bring that demand into the new offer. And this is what we're doing by progressively shifting from oil to gas in our legacy energies and from fossil fuels to decarbonized liquids, gases, and electrons. Liquids, gases, and electrons. You will all be driving an electric car in Washington, D.C., but no baker will deliver something in India or in the outskirts of France without an internal combustion engine. So we need to decarbonize that internal combustion engine as much as we decarbonize electrons for the Tesla. And that's what we're doing with the biorefining mechanism. And lastly, on breakthroughs, and this is very relevant for the United States, where we are the biggest investor on the largest fusion exercise, we need to create those breakthroughs that deliver the 50% of emissions reductions that we don't have. Carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, fusion, new non-competitive biofuels, new renewable technologies. We are investing across the board, and I think this is the reason why our ranking is as such.
Wow, this was just the first question for each of them. So
Settle in for a long night.
yes. So maybe coming back to Fabio and going back to private climate finance that has grown in recent years, but still need to be significantly scaled up to cut greenhouse gas emission and achieve the objective of the Paris Agreement. What are the constraints of public funding, given the huge investment needs, and what has been done in order to foster private financing?
So,
And of course, the question is for you, but please feel free to join at one point.
So I'm just going to walk you through some of these steps here, and then I'll come back to Marco's point, because I think he made two important points on the disclosure, financing of technology, transfer of technology to emerging markets in particular. the starting point, I think, is today about 2/3 of emissions come from EMs. So even if magically what Marco said, it occurs in advanced economies, you still have 2/3 of emissions that needs to go away somewhere. And those are low-income countries, emerging markets, where there is no fiscal capacity to do that, to finance this kind of transition. So they're coming out of COVID, debt levels are very high, fiscal outlook has deteriorated, financing costs are higher, central bank don't have any monetary policy, so it's more expensive to invest. There's effectively no fiscal space to do this. So the only way to finance that 2/3 reduction in greenhouse gas emissions is private finance. I think that's something that it's not even a discussion. The issue is how do you bring private finance there? Because emerging markets have a number of risks that are idiosyncratic to them, right? There's FX risk, there's political risk, macroeconomic risk, and so on, particularly for some of the low-income countries. So how do you bring private finance there? There are two sort of barriers to this. I think one has to do with demand side. So even if you get money to emerging markets, you need to have projects to finance, right? So you need some technology transfer there. You need to have ambitious projects in climate. You also need to have bankable projects, right? They need to be something that can reach capital market. So you need to work on the demand side of the demand for capital. Then there is the supply side, where the thinking we're trying to do is what we call blended finance. So trying to blend essentially public money, whether this is official assistance in the form of government support, philanthropic money, but some public/donor money with capital, with private capital, to scale up the private capital. And so there are a number of barriers there too. Some of them has to do with a lot of the solutions are bespoke. So they're very specific to specific projects in specific countries. So how do you scale that up? This blended finance approach is not a typical asset allocation, so there's no role for some of the major international financial institutional investors. There's no bucket for this blended finance. So how do you do that? In some cases, the fiduciary duties of the managers is not to incorporate climate. So how do you bring it into if they're just looking at risk rewards? How do you scale up in terms of pooling? How do you pool projects? So there's a number of issues on the supply side that needs to be addressed. The solution that we have in mind is like three pieces. I think one has to do with, we need to align the incentive of investor here with those who need capital. And so we need financial instruments that do a better job with this, right? So there are green bonds, there are green loans. What would do probably a good job at aligning interest is what we call sustainability linked instruments, where the payout of these instruments is linked to the achievement of some climate objective. There are some of this in the sovereign wealth, in the sovereign world, so primarily like sovereign debt, how to bring it to corporates, and how do you scale this up. So that's one objective. The other one is we need to broaden the investor set, right? We need not just the traditional commercial banks, the traditional investment funds. You need to bring as much diverse sorts of private capital as possible because they have different risk profile, different time horizon, different ability to absorb losses, different thinking in terms of what the upside is, for example, for equity. So you need to broaden that. But then ultimately, it boils down to using public money to provide some sort of first loss, right? You need to, otherwise money is not going to go to emerging markets. Traditionally, that job is multilateral development banks. So think of like, I don't know, the World Bank, the IFC, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank. But those institutions, by design, they are not designed to take losses, right? There is some what we call concessional funding. So whether this is from government money or this is philanthropies, but then they come in at market rates, right? So their use of their balance sheet, even if, of course, we would like to have more balance sheet, the NDBs, but even if you keep the balance sheet fixed, you need to provide more leverage, right? So right now, less than 5% of the balance sheet is used for first loss. So that number needs to grow. And you need to also increase the leverage that they can provide. Right now, for $1 of this MDB's balance sheet, on average, it's only 33 cents of private money. That number needs to be way higher. Now, there's a huge dispersion. There are deals where it's like north of 15, but there are deals where there's very little. So how do we scale that up? So those are, I think, the three pieces of this. We also need to improve, again, what we call this climate information architecture. And I think the Marco's points are very important there, right? So one, the data, I think we all agree we need better data. Without data, comparable quality, there is no way to price climate risk. So if we don't start from there, we're not going anywhere. But and that's particularly an issue for emerging markets, right? If you think of supply chain and cost of collecting data, the quality of data. But even if you have the data, then there is the transition aspect. And I think that's a really crucial point because the way advanced economy think in terms of transition of taxonomies. And by the way, taxonomies is not a very welcome word in the US. So the way we work for the US, we call it classifications. Whatever words you want to use, there are too many. 200 plus, it doesn't work. There are too many public and private. And how do we converge? Particularly, again, for EMs, it's not even an issue of convergence. It's an issue having in mind what transition taxonomy means, right? How to incentivize the system to become a little greener over time and set up the right incentive place. Not so much whether something is green or brown. The majority of stuff is in the middle. How do you move toward green a little bit more? How do you set it up dynamically? A lot of the advanced economies are, first of all, static, either it's green or not, and there's not very little incentive to become a little greener. So how do we do this for EMs? And then there's the disclosure part, right? You don't want to disclose based on different disclosure regimes in different countries. It's costly. That is what the ISSB and the IFRS Foundation are trying to do with this global standard, right? So that there is at least some baseline of this standard that it's common across firms globally. Then, of course, you need the data. What is the taxonomy that there is there? But that's, I think, work that is going in the right direction. We will never have the same taxonomy and the same approach, right? The US is much more principle-based, has a different approach to these things than Europe does. But is there a way to converge in terms of at least principle, to have some common principle that guides the disclosure here? I think that's where we can aim for. It's never going to be the same system, the same disclosure regime. With one caveat, if you don't do this, the system will be fragmented. A fragmentation of capital markets means that money will not go to emerging markets. It will be more costly to finance the transition. So how do we address this fragmentation? I think that's the main issue. I can come back to the IMF role if you want later.
Any reaction on this point, or?
I simply couldn't agree more, but and on the point of fragmentation, for technology development, industrialized economies and advanced economies are an essential space. If you fragment that, you don't have breakthrough technologies. Okay? So let me give you a very practical example. In Europe, we are committed, again, to publishing scope 1, 2, and 3 of emissions in a system that underpins an entire architecture of roles and responsibilities in the boardroom, and that underpins a whole set of commitments and targets and roadmaps that we're taking. This is allowing for a system that combines with the emissions trading scheme, that is an organic representation of how the private sector is embracing the climate roadmap. If you go in the United States for a piecemeal approach, where scope 3 is not published, scope 1 and 2 are not mandatory. For those who are not climate freaks, scope 1 is the emissions I produce, scope 2 is the emissions I buy, scope 3 is the emission I sell. Sorry, it's not like that. It's more complicated like that than that. But, so scope 3, E&I has taken scope 3 objectives because scope 3 is the representation of how you switch your product line day by day to a decarbonized product set. And if you don't publish that, and scope 1 and 2 are not subject to mandatory or at least articulate requirements, you will not come to a set that will, for example, agree on cross-border adjustment mechanisms and carbon taxing and the value of a CO2 ton. That will never converge. And I think this is a major risk for technology investments. I want to highlight Fabio's point. How do we direct investments on the technologies that we have to countries where the risk premium is higher? We need a new set of rules for development finance. We need a new set of rules for development finance. The United States is working on DFC. Every country is working. Italy is working on the Piano Mattei and on beefing up. Italy has started a climate fund worth 850 million euros a year for 5 years, the biggest in Europe. something that few people have noticed in the debate today. So we need to scale it up in the toolbox and in the size, because those investments are additional to the market. They are not happening just because of market action.
Yeah, just a couple of observations. You know, you mentioned the taxonomy and taxonomy in Europe being a religion, and I wanted to share a funny anecdote about Mario Nava, and many of you may know Mario, who was Mr. Taxonomy for a number of
text
years.
him.
Yeah, text him, really. He should be here tonight. Anyway, I had the pleasure of organizing a small breakfast event for him in San Francisco with a group of investors. And if you think that US investors are in a different world from European investors, you're mainly thinking about the East Coast. The West Coast is just like in another dimension altogether. So Mario, for those of you who don't know him, is one of the most charming people I've ever met in my life. And he...
Till tonight.
Until tonight. Certo. And he spent, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes explaining the rationale for the taxonomy, how beautifully organized it was, how perfect in all of its ways, and the people around the table were just staring at him as if he were, you know, from another planet. And finally one of them said, "I'm sorry, isn't that thing like 500 pages, and aren't you telling me about quadruple paned glass windows, that I can only invest in those and not triple pane? I'm not having anything to do with this." And I think it's a really good illustration, Fabio, of what you were saying about the difference in mentality. And the same thing goes for, you know, the Scope 3 emissions, the political environment here that is making it very difficult for the SEC to progress on its disclosure rules, and that is even making green hushing, I think, is the term, right? So a lot of our US members in these discussions, and they might used to participate actively and so on about green finance, are now, well, okay, I'm gonna proceed with my climate work and my climate commitments, but I'm not gonna make a big deal about it because I'm just gonna get shot down by, you know, hostile political forces in the US. And the other thing that comes up in these discussions is litigation risk, right? So if you look at the responses to the SEC on disclosure, a lot of them said, you need to write in safe harbor provisions, because what if I disclose something and it turns out not to be exactly right? I need to have some, you know, get out of jail card that enables me, if you want me to disclose, you're gonna force me to disclose, there better be some safe harbor. And more recently too, we've been hearing a lot about antitrust considerations, which is very interesting in the context of, you know, if you bring together a group of firms in, say, banks or what have you, even if they are putting their heads together for good purposes like green finance or climate commitments, you can still find some risk of collusion, and the antitrust, especially in this country, you know, the European Commission doesn't really see it like this, but certainly in the US it's a growing issue. So.
Can I add one quick thing
Yeah.
to this point though? Because I think I don't want to give the impression that this can only be fixed if you come from the regulatory side, right? Because in the US, a lot of the push now is coming from the investor side, right? They want disclosure.
Yeah.
And so, yes, the US has a different system, it's more principle-based, it's a completely different approach to this, but a lot of the push in the US is coming from the investor side, right? They want firms to start decarbonizing, they want to have information, they want to push more into the climate world. So it is a different approach, but some of it doesn't have to be all resolved through regulations. Otherwise, I feel very hopeless if that's the only way to do it.
Can I add one? Sorry. I absolutely agree, but there is a question of standardization. It cannot be that
Agreed.
any single hedge fund
Yeah,
for
of course.
any single portfolio
Yes.
company or any single participant in the market for any single portfolio company goes through the annual report and develop a company-specific model. This is not happening.
No, of course.
And the taxonomy has been, in one way, a sort of green card for those who were on the right side of the taxonomy on ESG issues so far. And this has to stop. Why is the ESG chain of new technologies, clean technologies, critical materials and minerals have to be less considerate, articulate, and deep than we have known and we need to know in traditional energies? is not that because I am producing a solar panel, I have to be subject to less scrutiny than if I produce a molecule of gas, or if I want to do carbon capture and storage, or if I want to do nuclear. I have to be ESG compliant in the old and in the new world alike. And this will prove critical when we move to the scale up of the extractive industries in critical regions of the world, such as Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. We cannot afford taxonomy to be the wild card for those who want to have ESG dumping thanks to the taxonomy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would like to move now to another topic. We are at the 1 year mark anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this has highlighted a new relationship between energy security and climate transition. How should we consider these dynamics, the role of private finance play, and more broadly, the increased geopolitical risk affect the transition toward a greener economy? I would like to start with Marco, and then we can all start the debate.
Well, there's two different questions in what you asked. The first question is, how do we react to an event? I was teaching my course at Lewis on February 24, and I had a module on energy security that morning. I was ready not to say what my usual take would be. But it is true that for 70 years, the sanctity of contracts and the separation between energy trade and political dynamics had been a constant presence in European-Russian relations. Historians will tell us if this started to crack in 2006, in 2009, or in 2014. With 2006 is the first short interruption of flows with Ukraine. 2009 is a serious interruption that leaves some portions of the then Eastern European countries, a fully fledged part of Europe, out in the cold at the beginning of January, and 2014 is, of course, the invasion of Crimea. Whatever the historians tell us, soon after February 24, the crack is wide open. There is no future for the past. It's very difficult to imagine that a system such as the one that Putin has destroyed with the invasion of Ukraine can even be rearticulated. So the first priority on the energy dimension is replacing the single most important source of gas into Europe. We are speaking volumes that ranged beyond the 30%, that were flying towards 40% of total imports. Let me give you the number of my country, and let me be proud that I serve for a company that is the enabler of the government objectives in this field. We have done, in the same year, minus 50% of Russian gas, of our first source. In the second winter, we'll do minus 80. And in the third winter, we will be independent. And this is not happening without constructing a whole series of new relationships that will be a pivotal, essential source of energy security for Italy and Europe in the decades to come. I'm speaking Algeria, I'm speaking Egypt, I'm speaking Libya, I'm speaking the Eastern Mediterranean, but I'm also speaking Congo, Angola, Nigeria, Mozambique. These are countries that have the opportunity and now have the struggle to rush to come to our rescue because we didn't diversify enough. Italy, including because of its geographical setting, proved a much better player in diversification with the Southern Corridor, with LNG terminals, than others in Europe. But still we fell short. So short term, we need to reconstruct the traditional energy supply system. And of course, let me say clearly, we need to help Ukraine remaining a portion of the European energy network in power, as Italy is doing, and in gas and other sources. I wish we could today have more hope for moving to a second part of the conversation, but clearly this first anniversary is still very uncertain, and obviously we can only hope for the Ukrainian people to be restored in their freedom and life as soon as possible. You bridge it with the energy transition question, because obviously comes the question of how the Russian invasion of Ukraine impacts. And I think it impacts two ways. In the short term, it impacts in a way that we need to mobilize all what we know about financing the transition to make sure that the infrastructure and the investments we need in the short term are done quickly, properly, and are future-proof. For example, LNG terminals. LNG is clearly a major option for the future because it will address different portions of demand worldwide. It is compatible with hydrogen and with the development of hydrogen supply chains, etc., etc., etc. But we also need to acknowledge that this is a trigger for a consolidation of a just transition model that needs to embrace our new partners, for example, in Africa, on things that are also beyond carbon. I'll give you an example of what we're doing in Kenya. In Kenya, we started an advanced biofuel supply chain model that is now having the cooperation of 20,000 farmers with proprietary developed crops. And this is supplying the first biorefineries that we converted in Italy, Gela and Marghera, and allowing us to sell for the first time pure biofuels at the fuel station. So you can go with your Fiat, not with your Tesla, you can go with your Fiat and have a decarbonized diesel for your Fiat, a decarbonized fuel for your internal combustion engine. So, to the point, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine is telling us that we need to accelerate on an all of the above approach and all of the regions approach. And here, COP28 in the United Arab Emirates will be absolutely the sounding board of a change in pace and of a change in tone of voice.
Thank you. A quick reaction, Sonia?
Yeah, just, I would agree with all of that. And this is not a trade-off between energy security and climate transition. Far from it. Really, it's the energy security imperative makes climate transition more important, not less. And so really the aftermath of the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis that we've had are just an opportunity to enable a green transition. So you've seen lots of market incentives being provided, movement on the regulatory front. So enabling the transition, especially in high emitting sectors, climate vulnerable countries. The energy crisis and the climate crisis are two sides of the same coin. You can't disentangle them, you can't pay attention to one and not the other. And when you think about the policies that have been coming out, you've got China and its 14th 5-year plan on green, and the Repower EU plan, the US Inflation Reduction Act, which, as you know, has little to do with inflation reduction and more to do with climate investment and subsidies. But when you talk about subsidies and industrial policy, you're really talking about the risk of protectionism. So that's the flip side of the coin here. I think we'll see lots of movement, lots of investing in opportunities, lots of incentives to do this, but also growing risk of the kind of fragmentation we've been talking about.
Thank you very much. Fabio?
Briefly, a couple of things. I think Marco's point on if you want short-term transition versus medium-term endpoint. I think that's an important point, right? Because where you see tension between the energy security point and the transition is in the short term, right? So this is like a shock that suddenly made the transition more expensive. Because you need minerals, they could be in some part of the world because of a number of reasons. The cost of capital is higher. And so in the short term, and that's priority for security, obviously, for energy security. But the endpoint, the two objectives coincide, because the only way to get to energy security, if you build up more on renewables, and you move away from reliance on some source of fossil fuel. So I think if you work on those, the endpoint is the same, so they can actually work together and reinforce each other. There are some risks along this path though. One is the fragmentation, right? Again, to this point. You need some type of minerals, for example, they could be in the wrong side of the geopolitical fault line. And so that has implication in terms of not just cost of those input into renewables, but also availability. You need to have them. So there is that aspect of the geopolitics that is new. There is the social aspect. I think that's often it's not enough highlighted. For some of, especially poor emerging market countries, there is a huge social cost to switching from one to the other, right? You could be on the winning side under the fossil fuel and completely on the loser side on the other side, and vice versa, right? So there are social aspects that need to be considered, because this is one of the important reasons for social unrest in a number of countries. So that is another point I think it's worth making here. And the last point is, and that's something we have seen during the war, the commodities markets, it's a global market, and it was and has been a major source of financial strains in terms of not just the physical aspect, but also the derivatives part. Right? They've shown clearly fault lines in the way the global financial system works in the commodities market. That needs to be addressed, because that was an important source of financial stability risk especially at the beginning of the war.
Thank you. So before opening the question, maybe a round on summarizing what you believe the top priorities should be this year in order to support climate transition that was mentioned before. Fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been talking about public-private sector dialogue. That's super important because we're all trying to address the same problems. A very gradual approach to transition planning, and especially when you talk about things like mandatory transition planning, there are so many steps that need to be taken, and this is such a complex task that I think we need to be very careful with how quickly the regulatory environment is evolving. In terms of financing, I think one thing that we haven't really touched on is the links between climate and debt. As you all know, global debt levels have increased tremendously in this era of low interest rates. Now interest rates are starting to go up. A number of countries are getting into trouble. We need to find better solutions to this, because at the end of the day, if you want climate finance and transition finance for high risk, as you were saying, emerging markets, I mean, it's no easier than raising any other kind of finance. If you have this kind of overarching debt and credit risk, it's extremely difficult. And then, you know, dealing with the geopolitical strains that confront us. If you have major tensions, whether that's Russia-Ukraine war, US-China tensions, it simply makes global cooperation much, much more difficult. Climate is a global problem with local implications. And if we can't come together in the G20, for example, on global solutions, like to carbon pricing, for example, countries will just simply pursue their own solutions, and that's a big risk.
Thank you. Marco.
Well, you asked priorities, so two keywords and two key priorities. In addressing the short-term issues, we need to restore security and transition conformity of the new gas investments. So we need to have a secure set of players, and we need to make sure that this is accelerating the transition and not delaying it. One word that I wanted to mention in this case is, for example, investing on methane emissions. Is that additional to the market? Sometimes yes. Is there a lot of value in doing this? Absolutely yes. So for example, international financial institutions will be a major source of re-engagement on moving this new wave of gas investments in terms of infrastructure, new productions, into a transition, a compliant pattern. And then the reshaping of the geopolitical dynamics around the longer term transition goals. And here I see two subsets. The first subset is engaging with a new world and with the new regions with a revamped approach. We've seen Janet Yellen spending 10 days in sub-Saharan Africa. There is a flurry of visits. The European Union, Italy, has a big priority on sub-Saharan Africa and obviously on North Africa. So engagement is good. A policy is better. And we need to continue a transatlantic vision there. This is the second aspect. Because if the transatlantic player moves separately, America, for example, in Africa, will have a lesser clout. Let's be clear. Investments in sub-Saharan Africa from the United States have dropped fourfold in the past 20 years. Europe has an important footprint. Italy, France, Spain, Germany, the Nordic countries. We need to work together to offer sub-Saharan African countries not an alternative to China, but a complement to China. If we don't do that together, nobody does it. And there, and my last point is, I think the big misunderstanding on IRA that have been instrumentalized on either sides of the camp need to be overcome. IRA is a tremendous contribution to adding value into the climate change compliant investments in decreasing cost of technologies, but it cannot be that IRA is an exclusionary measure towards the allies that today face the consequences of the war. And there are measures in IRA that are really hard to understand if they do not reacquire rapidly a transatlantic dimension. Think of circular economy and secondary critical minerals. Come on, we in Europe, we in Italy are, way more advanced than this market is in the United States. You will never reach the objectives of IRA if you keep it segregated to a Buy American model. And how can it be that Europe is not today perceived as a necessary partner of IRA? On the European side, maybe we will go beyond a very trade nitty-gritty specific approach. I do not know. I do not know the solutions, but definitely that part of the conversation this year needs to be sorted out in favor of keeping the transatlantic friendship that the Russian invasion on Ukraine has cemented the way it is now.
Fabio?
I am most certainly staying away from this argument. Given that all 190 members of the fund are equal to me, and I serve all the members, so I'm not going there. But the point of international cooperation is crucial, though, right? Individual countries' policies have spillover effect, particularly large countries, large advanced economies. And so, to me, the emerging market aspect is the more important here. If we don't get capital there, if we don't get technology there, this won't be fixed by Europe or the US by themselves. In fact, it won't be fixed, period. So there has to be a way to rethink some of the international financial architecture and how to bring private money, first loss, into these countries. Otherwise, we won't fix the emission issue, no matter how hard the US and Europe try. The last point, perhaps, which we haven't touched yet, we discussed some of the technology part, but there are also sectors where you get most of the buck, right? So the hard emitting sector like cement, steel, where I think technology advancement can actually, you will have a really significant impact there. And some of them are very hard to finance. So some of the technology, I think, focus on where you can reduce more and put money into those technology. Marco talked about some of this, but I think those sectors are crucial, particularly in countries they don't have a lot of money to invest. Right? So that would be, I think, where I would put more emphasis.
So thank you so much to our panelists. I hope you can join me for an applause to them. For coming, please enjoy our chat now with the panelists and